Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. How you doing? We good? So it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. I admire so much what Beacon does. I have an autistic brother who, like a lot of people like him, it's easy to make assumptions about him. He's an unusual person in a lot of ways, but also has unusual talents and is a very bright person. If you were here, he would, and if you were going to converse with any of you, what he would ask is when your birthday is, and he would immediately tell you what day of the week you were born. Then he'd tell you what day of the week your birthday is going to be this year and next year and 10 years from now and 20 years from now. And I always have to say my mom would particularly be pleased I'm here and particularly pleased at the work of Beacon because my brother was a school kid in the 70s and it was not great for kids like him with learning disabilities and other special needs. And she had to fight like a caged lion with other moms to get these kids the respect and the education they deserve. So Beacon really stands for something really important to me and to my family. So I just want to salute you guys for what you do. Thank you so much. So Daryl said a lot of things about me, and as is obligatory in such introductions, they're all nice. But if you wanted to boil it down, he could have just said I'm a political pundit, which means I make erroneous predictions about political ephemera for a living, right? So someone has to do it. So a couple things about me. I am a writer. I do care about words. I hate euphemism. I want people to use the correct word for real things. But I know I'll never win in this battle. And this was brought home to me as truths about life often are, by your kids and your family, by my daughter who learned a couple years ago now the word stupid, which is not the worst word a kid is ever going to learn, but it's kind of annoying because she's very pleased with herself. She's calling everything stupid, and you got this cute little toddler going around stupid this, stupid that. So I took her aside one day and I was like, Julia, don't use the word stupid. Why don't you use the word ill-considered instead, right? So I'm the editor of a major opinion magazine. I got to try, right? And of course, this had no effect on her. Stupid, on it goes. This was about the same time that she was getting potty trained, and my wife would put in a little extra pad in her pants just as an insurance in case something went wrong. And one Saturday morning, she gets up, she goes to the bathroom, has a very successful trip to the toilet, and I guess in an excess of zeal, turns around and throws the pad in the toilet, flushes the whole thing, it backs up. It's a sewer nightmare in there. My wife, who's always at the working at the edge of her nerves with a couple kids in the house, she always blames me when this kind of stuff happens. I don't know, maybe appropriately, I don't know. But she's like, Rich, you go clean that up. And I'm in there, I'm swabbing, I'm mopping, and all the rest of it. And Rich, you got to have a talk with her. She can't do this, you got to have a talk with her. I was all right, I'll have a talk with her. I finally clean everything up. I come out and I take Julia on my knee and I said, we're going to have a good daughter-father moment here. And I said, Julia, what did you do wrong? She's like, Daddy, I did something ill-considered. So the other thing to know about me, I'm a very conservative Republican guy, but not necessarily a huge fan of Donald Trump. That sort of sets me apart from my clan at the moment. We fought a lot in 2016. I wrote mean things about him. He called me a loser repeatedly. But we've sort of patched things up, not entirely, but sort of. And during his presidency, I was at a dinner one night, and someone was explaining how Republican senators had found out if you wanted to get in touch with Trump, what you would do, you just call the White House switchboard between like 7 and 9 p.m., and all he was doing was sitting in the residence watching Fox. So he wasn't occupied, and you get just put right through. I was like, heck, I can do that. So a couple nights later, I said to my wife after the kids are in bed, do you mind if I call President Trump tonight? She's like, do whatever you want, but I don't want to talk to him. So I called the White House switchboard, 202-456-1414. Rich Lowry, National Review, I'm calling for President Trump. Hold, please. It's like, dear God, are you really going to put me right through to him? And there's a little bit of a hold, and then a nice lady picked up the phone. He's busy, sir, can I take your name and number? I'll have him call you tomorrow. I was like, okay, whatever. I gave her my name and number. And then sure enough, the next day, the unknown caller comes up on my phone, and it was President Trump calling me back. And I relayed this story to Senator Lindsey Graham at the time. He said, yeah, Rich, President Trump's the easiest guy to get in Washington. And he told me, Graham, that when he was having trouble having Secretary of State Mike Pompeo call him back, Graham would call Trump to call Pompeo to tell Pompeo to call Graham. So, and about a month ago, Trump called me out of the blue, and he's like, "Rich, you're doing okay." You're like, and he had just come off the golf course. And I said, "Sir, you have a good round." He's like, "Rich, I'm really good at golf. I've won 12 tournaments down here, but you're okay. You're like at 52 or 54%. But you're getting better. So I'm going to keep talking to you." And this is what a politician does. Like, he works someone, and over the summer I had lunch with them. In Bedminster, his place in New Jersey, same thing, just working me. And at the end, he does this thing that all good politicians do. So we've been sitting there for 90 minutes, very pleasant. And then an aide scurries in, like, "Sir, there's this very important person you need to call in 10 minutes. And Trump's like, "Are you sure? Are you sure I need to do that in 10 minutes? Sure, you have to." So the kid leaves. And then 10 minutes later, dutifully comes back. And Trump's like, "No, I'm not calling. This is more important." So that was just meant to make me feel important. And it did make me feel important, right? So that's why politicians do it. So I'm not going to talk about contemporary politics tonight. Happy to go anywhere you want, though, in the Q&A. Talk a little bit about Lincoln. Why Lincoln? I wrote a couple years ago a book about Lincoln. I think it's always valuable to focus on Lincoln. And I hope, I promise maybe even to give you some fresh insights about Lincoln tonight, and maybe have you think about him in an original way. If I don't live up to this guarantee, your price of admission will be refunded tonight. I guarantee you. All right, so this is the text I take for Lincoln that I think gets to the core of what you need to know about him. He's president during the Civil War, of course, and he gave this little talk to this regiment, the Ohio 166th Regiment. They had been doing some guard duty in Washington about 100 days or so. Not the toughest duty, but he said to these guys, whenever he met soldiers, he liked to tell them what they were fighting for. And what he said was, "I live in this big White House," that's the way he referred to the White House, "but someday one of your children might occupy this White House the way my father's child has," which is very kind of unusual elocution, right? What is he doing there? It's avoiding saying "I," right? He's avoiding being boastful in this private conversation with troops, which goes to a kind of a different character than we have in politicians today, I would say. And he tells them, "We're fighting this war to maintain our free institutions in order that each of you may have, through this free government which we have enjoyed, an open field and a fair chance for your industry, enterprise, and intelligence, that you may have equal privileges in the race of life." Now, that's a key Lincoln phrase. I'll come back to it. The race of life. Quote, "With all its desirable human aspirations. It is for this the struggle should be maintained, that we may not lose our birthright, not only for 1, but for 2 or 3 years. This nation is worth fighting for to secure such an inestimable jewel." Now, for me, this is the essential Lincoln. There are many, many things to know about Lincoln, but this is the most important one. And I want to talk a little bit tonight about the how and whys of that, and touch very briefly on its relevance for what's going on in the country today. Now, Lincoln is widely celebrated, obviously, these days across the political spectrum, but he's still widely misunderstood. There's this idea that Lincoln was kind of just this common guy who was an accidental politician. If you want to put it in a highfalutin way, you could quote James Russell Lowell, who said Lincoln was out of the very earth, or Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said he's the aboriginal man. This is complete nonsense. The first thing that Abraham Lincoln did when he left his home was run for office. He ran for office. Let's put aside the presidential races, which we all know about. He ran for office in 1832, 1834, 1836, 1838, 1840, 1843, 44, 46, 54, 55, and 58. There was nothing accidental about Abraham Lincoln's political ambition, and he possessed an extraordinary mind, not an ordinary commonsensical mind, but an extraordinary mind that anyone who was paying attention recognized from a very early age. He would borrow newspapers at a time when it was difficult to get newspapers. I guess it's difficult to get newspapers again, but it was for different reasons back then, and he would return them and be able to recite word for word the editorials, just like all National Review readers can. But this was extraordinary in a young man, and he had this great appreciation for what human nature really is and how people work. He used to tell a story to make the point that far-off rewards or punishments don't have an effect on anyone, and it was a story about an Irishman who supposedly stole a spade, and his neighbor said, "Patty," kind of politically incorrect argot of the day, "you're going to have to pay for that spade when you pass away and you meet your maker." And the Irishman supposedly said, "Well, okay, if you're going to credit me that long, I think I'll take another," right? So how did Lincoln know so much about life, about how people work? It's because he lived this, to use a cliche term, this incredible life of hard knocks. Again, when he was president, he loved the theater, as we know, but he loved Shakespeare. He was just soaked in Shakespeare. And he saw this Shakespeare play, a famous actor was in it, and Lincoln wrote him a private note about what was good in his performance, what was bad in his performance, what he liked about that particular play, the high points, the low points. And the actor is quite tickled, right? The way any of us would be if we got a letter from the President of the United States and he published it in a newspaper, and it led to all this ridicule of Lincoln. Here he is, he's supposed to be the commander-in-chief, and now what is he, the theater critic-in-chief? And this guy realized what a betrayal this had been and how wrong this had been, and he apologized to Lincoln, and Lincoln wrote back a little note saying, "Don't worry about it. Quote, throughout my life, I've encountered a lot of ridicule without much malice, and a lot of kindness not free of ridicule. I am used to it." And every time I read that, it's a little stab in my heart. So this goes to his upbringing in Kentucky and then in Indiana, which is incredibly hardscrabble, almost difficult to describe from our perspective. The area where they settled his family in Indiana, there's a story a year or two before, a little girl had been killed by a panther because her brother couldn't kill the bees quickly enough with a hatchet. Some of the other neighbors wrote later about how they would have a fire going at night in their log cabins, and they would see the glow of the eyes of wolves through the chinks in the logs. Lincoln's mother died of something called milk sick. A cow would wander out into the forest, eat a poisonous root. No one would have any idea this would happen. You drink the milk, and you die a horrible death in about a week. This happened to his mom and some family members right at the same time. He and his father had to fashion a wooden coffin and basically bury her in the backyard with no ceremony because there was no preacher in the vicinity for months at a time. He said this was not an area where there's a lot of education. His mother signed her name with an X. His stepmother, a wonderful lady who recognized his talent and fostered it, signed her name with an X, and he told a biographer that his father could barely, bunglingly sign his own name. And the biographer thought that was such a harsh way to put it, he didn't include it in the book he wrote. So we think about Lincoln commonly, because this was one of his nicknames, as the rail splitter president. And this was a product of this great political theater in the 1860 nominating convention, where they bring out these rails from Illinois or from Indiana, and Lincoln's like, yeah, I think I might have split some of those rails myself. But the thing to know about Lincoln is that he hated rails and never wanted to split another damn rail in his life. So everything he did was geared towards escaping this backwoods existence. He told another story in the White House about how when he was a kid, in kind of rivers, that's where the activity was at this time. And he was sitting at the river with a rowboat, and these guys came up in a carriage, and they needed to catch a steamboat that was coming down the river, but there wasn't a wharf. So they had no way of getting out there. So they say, hey, kid, will you row us out to the steamboat, and our luggage? Like, sure, I'll do it. And he rows them out, and they're getting on the boat. And Lincoln, decades later, says he said to them as they're about to disappear, hey, wait a minute, you didn't pay me anything. And each of them tossed a silver $50 down into the bottom of his boat. And Lincoln said, from that moment, I realized I had earned my first dollar.
and I was a more hopeful and optimistic being from that time. And this is the key thing. Lincoln wanted an America where you could earn $1 and where you had to earn $1. And in a nutshell, that's why he wasn't a Democrat. So, and he really wasn't a Democrat. Again, I'm the International Review. You got to get some of these digs in. So at the time, everyone who lived in this area and around Lincoln was a Democrat. They worshipped Andrew Jackson, right? This great American general, this great Mars of the American backwoods. If you want to understand Jackson in a nutshell, think about, Larry David from Curb Your Enthusiasm, this sort of curmudgeonly character, except for he might kill you, right? That was Andrew Jackson. And the Democrats at the time, they romanticized agriculture, they romanticized the backwoods, and they played up the virtues of yeoman farmers. As a Democratic journalist wrote, the difference between the Democrats and the Whigs is that the Democrats represent the hardy rustics and the Whigs represent the lank, sallow accountants. And the thing is, Lincoln wanted to be with the accountants. He became a determined Whig, and he didn't do it for partisan reasons. He didn't do it for power. The Whigs never won a governorship in the state of Illinois. They never won a Senate race in the state of Illinois. They never won a presidential race in the state of Illinois. But Lincoln was a totally committed Whig. He hated party opportunists. He hated party switchers. There was a story about a Whig who had become a Democrat and gotten a nice plum appointment and bought himself a nice house with the salary and put a lightning rod on the top of the house. And this was kind of a big deal at the time. Most people didn't have lightning rods. Supposedly this was the first lightning rod that Lincoln had ever said, and he was engaged in an intense political debate with this guy who owned this home and this lightning rod. And Lincoln threw at him at some point, you know what, I value and seek political distinction and accomplishment as much as anyone else in the world, but I would never want to find myself where I would have to erect a lightning rod on my house to protect a guilty conscience from an offended God. So what draws Lincoln to the Whigs? Well, there are two things. One, it's their economic program, which says, this goes back to the dollar, that we're going to have a cash economy. And if we're going to have a cash economy, you have to have banks. Lincoln was a huge supporter of banks. He was a huge supporter of the State Bank of Illinois. At some point, Democrats were trying to eliminate the state bank. There's a big legislative maneuver that had to happen, or a quorum that had to be denied. And Lincoln, he was embarrassed about this afterwards, as the state legislature jumped out the window of the State House to avoid being there for a quorum, and this opened up to mockery. Fortunately, the window was not that high. Actually, his legs were so long they probably touched the ground from the window, and we're going to have to build a higher legislature. So next time, Lincoln will have to crawl down a spout when he is trying to escape. So he's pro-banks. Whigs also believe we're going to have an industrializing economy. It's not going to just be an agricultural economy forevermore. So we're going to have tariffs, and the country needs to be knit together into a functioning market. So that means we're going to have steamboats. We're going to have canals. We're going to have railroads. And Lincoln loved all those things because prior to the advent of those, it was very hard to get anything to market. You could float stuff in a raft down the Mississippi, which was fairly easy, and get it out into the sea, and then you can go anywhere relatively cheaply and quickly. But how do you get back home, right? People would literally walk. There's a story that Lincoln's father took one of these trips down the Mississippi with something and walked home. So that's obviously not a plausible way to have an economy. And what a railroad does, it just instantly transforms any area that's touched by it. Because instantly you're connected to the rest of the country. Instantly, you and your family and your wife, you can buy goods from the East, right? Things you could never imagine having. Well, how are you going to buy them? Again, you need cash. How are you going to get cash? You know what you're going to do? You're going to grow your crops for the market. not just for yourself as a subsistence farmer anymore. And in fact, you might not even grow good crops for yourself anymore because you're going to buy them. So the railroad just has a huge effect in transforming the country into a market. So Lincoln supports all these things which are called internal improvements at the time. And then there's another aspect of the Whig program which is very important. And the Whig insight was that it's not enough to just have a market. You have to have people who are disciplined and hardworking enough to take advantage of the market. So they supported internal improvements to the canals and the steamboats and all the rest, but they supported, just as importantly, self-improvement. As a historian of the Whigs has said, what they valued was order, harmony, purposefulness, and improvement. So Lincoln believed in this deeply. And again, the Democrats didn't. Andrew Jackson, this is the reason why he was celebrated. He was a man of passions. He was a dueler. He owned slaves. He was a great warrior. And Lincoln recoiled from all of those things. When it came to a duel, actually, Lincoln did almost fight a duel with a rival politician named James Shields. Lincoln anonymously insulted him, I believe in a newspaper article. Shields realized this was Lincoln, challenged Lincoln to a duel. They actually went to the dueling grounds. As the challenged party, Lincoln was able to choose the weapons and chose cavalry broadswords. And this thing was worked out at the end, but some people thought, well, this is Lincoln showing his contempt for the institution of a duel. He's making a mockery of the whole thing. I'm not so sure, because the other guy was like 5'8", and Lincoln was like 6'2", with incredibly long arms. And someone actually asked him about this afterwards, and Lincoln said, no, I thought if I chose pistols, he might shoot me. So it was a very practical choice. But at a time when America was soaked in alcohol, was soaked in tobacco, when coarse language was the norm, Lincoln didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he didn't chew, he didn't swear. He told the occasional blue story, but he didn't swear. And he liked to tell a story on himself about being in a railway car once, and this Kentucky gentleman came and offered him a fine cigar. He said, no thanks. Offered him a shot of whiskey. He said, no thanks. Offered him a chew of tobacco. Like, no thanks. And finally, this guy, very frustrated, said, sir, can I share some wisdom I've gained through my long years? And Lincoln is what is it? And the guy said, he who has few vices has damn few virtues. In that sense, Lincoln had damn few virtues. And also a time of great casual cruelty to animals. And Lincoln, in contrast, incredibly tenderhearted about animals. So he was a lawyer, and you'd ride the circuit, right? You're going from one jurisdiction to the other on horseback with all these other guys, stopping in these things that could barely be called hotels. It's a real kind of guy's environment. And they were out one day riding, and Lincoln just disappeared. And finally, when the guy who'd been in the back with Lincoln rode up, where's Lincoln? And the guy said, well, last time I saw him, there's this bird's nest that had fallen from the tree, and he was trying to get it up in the tree. And Lincoln comes back, and they're kind of ridiculing him, asked, well, why did you do this? And Lincoln said, literally, if I had not returned those baby birds to their mother, I would not have been able to sleep tonight. There was a cat, when Lincoln was president, in the White House, and it would sit at the dinner table, and Lincoln would feed it with the White House flatware, which you'd imagine Mary Todd was not thrilled with this practice, and she was complaining about it one night, and Lincoln said, well, you know what, actually, if this silver spoon was good enough for President Buchanan, it's good enough for Tabby. So what does Lincoln do with his incredible ethic of self-improvement? Well, he becomes, as I mentioned, a lawyer. And he, at first, was quite a small-time lawyer. There's a folder they found in his office at some point. It was just marked, if you can't find it anywhere else, look here. He apparently had dropped some seeds in the office at some point, and it was so dingy and dirty that a plant grew up in one of the corners because there was enough dirt. But a young lawyer, aspiring lawyer, wrote to him and said, how do I become a lawyer? And Lincoln said, work is the main thing. His stepbrother actually lived never escaped the backwoods and lived in a subsistence existence there, and therefore was always short on cash and would always be asking Lincoln for money. And Lincoln wrote back, this might have made for awkward Thanksgivings, but he said, "You are destitute because you idle away all your time. Go to work is the only cure for your case." So Lincoln did that and becomes, and again, this is something that doesn't fully accord with our image of him, becomes, this is a bit of an anachronism to put it this way, but becomes a major corporate lawyer in Illinois. He's representing the biggest corporate interest in the state, the railroads. And this is because Lincoln has this view, the very Whig view, that property rights are extremely important, the rule of law is extremely important, and a properly functioning market economy, he believes there should be no class conflict, and there certainly shouldn't be redistributionist economics. In the White House, he was visited by a group of laborers, and he said, "Let not him who is houseless pull down a house of another, but labor diligently to build one of his own." And this just goes to Lincoln's profound belief in the dignity of labor and the right to the proceeds of your own labor. He loved a quote from Genesis in the Bible, "It is by the sweat of thy brow that thou shalt earn thy bread." Or as he put it himself more informally, "He who makes the corn should eat the corn." And at this time, before you were age 21, your parents could hire you out. Lincoln was a big, brawny guy, not brawny, but big and strong. And his father, who worked very hard, Lincoln, as I referred to obliquely earlier, had kind of contempt for his father. Wasn't a great relationship, but his father was breaking down physically and would hire Lincoln out. And Lincoln would go do these mindless, arduous labor, and his father would take the proceeds, would take the money. And Lincoln said of this later, "I used to be a slave because I worked and someone else took the proceeds." Now that's an exaggeration. It's a self-pitying exaggeration, but it gets to how important this principle was to him, which gets to his opposition to real slavery. What's one of the famous phrases from the second inaugural address? He calls slavery unrequited toil, work that you're not getting paid for. He would write these little logical puzzles for himself, or little speech fragments, kind of working stuff out in his head and kind of absentmindedly put them in his hat. And one of these little fragments he wrote about ants. And he said that this principle, that when you work for something, when you labor for something, it's yours, is so basic to all of existence that even this lowest crawling insect knows it's true. If an ant picks up a crumb and is working to get it back to its nest, and you try to take the crumb from the ant will fight you, because the ant knows through its labor it's earned that crumb. That crumb is its, not yours. And so for Lincoln, this goes to his opposition to slavery. And there was an opposing view from the South, which is that the North had wage slavery, right? So yeah, sure, there were slaves who had to work on plantations for no money in the South, but there are these wage slaves in the North who are in factories and not getting paid very much, and that was equally as bad. And Lincoln just totally rejected this and said, look, they don't understand how the system works, because he who labors for another last year labors for himself this year, and the year after that hires someone to labor for him. Advancement and improvement of condition are a fundamental principle of a society of equals. And Lincoln in the 1850s, as we're beginning to work up to the Civil War, he has this profound sense of loss, because he thinks this ideal is being willfully forgotten and neglected. And indeed, in the South, there's this myth now, 1619 Project and others, that the Revolution was about protecting slavery. Actually, 1776, the Revolution, it led to a major opening on racial issues, manumission laws in the North, loosening of racial restrictions, and then there was a backsliding in the South. And in the prime of Lincoln's political career, we see that backsliding. And we begin to see positive defenses of slavery. Initially, kind of everyone was embarrassed by it. The founders didn't write the word in the Constitution because they thought it would go away. But the South begins to feel defensive, has an economic incentive, and begins to offer the defense that, no, this is an institution from God. Slavery is not something to be embarrassed by. It's not something that's going to go away. It's a positive good. And Lincoln is just appalled by this. And in our society, kind of always from the beginning, we've worshipped what was new. We do it all the time now. Lincoln was obsessed with what was old, certainly in this regard. He would say, we need to readopt the Declaration of Independence. He would say, our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us renew it and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood, of the American Revolution. And this, for me, is one of just the key insights about Lincoln and about the American project. How we make things new, how we make progress, is constantly going back to these foundations, going back to what is old, going back to what is timeless. And as we know, Lincoln has big debates with Stephen Douglas, where all this is at play. He wins a moral victory in that race, but loses that Senate race. We know he goes on to be elected president, and he did this great tour as he was heading to Washington to take the office, and he gave a speech in Philadelphia that, again, goes to how important this principle was to him. He said, the founders believed that in due time, weights should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. If this country cannot be saved without giving up on that principle, I was about to say I would rather be assassinated on the spot than surrender. So we know what happens subsequently. So I'll just conclude by saying I think we need to reconnect with this aspect of Lincoln in this moment, because we have a crisis of opportunity in this country. We have a crisis of work in this country. We have a crisis of social isolation in this country, and a crisis of a lack of self-improvement. So the question before us is not whether we'll be a rich country. We're going to be a rich country for a very long time. It's going to be hard to mess that up. Or whether we're going to be a powerful country. We will be a powerful country for a very long time. The question is whether we'll continue to be a good country, whether we'll continue to be a fluid and dynamic society best suited for the pursuit of happiness, will we continue to be an America that Lincoln envisioned and fought for, where a bright kid literally from nowhere can make the most of himself and rise to unimagined heights. And I always like to conclude with a wonderful speech Lincoln gave, famous speech called the Lyceum Address, before he was a politician, before he was running for president. And he said in that speech, even I think it was in the 1830s or 1840s, we weren't the superpower we are now, but he said even then, you could take the biggest army in the world and put the greatest general in world history at its head, Napoleon Bonaparte, and that army could not take a step on the Blue Ridge Mountains or a drink from the Potomac River by force of arms. Then he went on to say, if destruction be our lot, we ourselves must be its author and its finisher. As a nation of free men, we either must live through all time or die by suicide. And I believe that the spirit and example of Abraham Lincoln still show us how to live. Thank you very much.